Saipan. Early morning, 1944. No artillery, no bombs, nothing falling from the sky. Yet a tunnel network holding more than 4,000 Japanese soldiers suddenly trembled as if someone had yanked it apart from the inside. Above ground, American Marines looked at each other, unsure of what had just happened. And below them, whole sections of tunnel began to buckle, rooms turned breathless, and escape shafts sealed themselves even though no one had attacked them. All of this started from something completely ordinary. A radio signal everyone else assumed was noise, and a young Navy technician who decided to listen again when others had already moved on. Hidden in that transmission was a detail so small it barely existed. A faint echo lasting 0.16 seconds. Tiny, forgettable, easy to miss. But that echo led straight to the only weak point in Japan's underground fortress, and became the reason it collapsed without a single American explosive touching it. What the Marines felt that morning was only the final consequence of something Eleanor Reeves had noticed hours earlier in a cramped intercept room aboard the USS Maryland. The room was stifling, machines humming against the metal walls, stacks of acetate recordings piling up beside her, Japanese transmissions labeled as interference, static, meaningless fragments from low-power field radios. To everyone else, they were just scraps of sound from dying equipment. To her, one of them didn't behave like noise at all. She played it once, then again, then slowed it down. Under the scratchy Morse code was a soft repeating bounce like the faint thump you'd hear when tapping a pipe in an empty basement. It came back at the exact same interval every time, 0.16 seconds. It wasn't a glitch, and it wasn't an operator tapping twice. It was an echo. Something solid and confined was reflecting that sound. On its own, that shouldn't have meant much. Except for one thing. Up on Saipan, Marines were fighting an enemy they couldn't see. Japanese units appeared from slopes that had been cleared the day before, attacked with precision, then melted back underground like smoke disappearing into cracks. Flamethrowers sealed one cave only for shots to erupt from another vent 100 meters away. Engineers tried blasting suspected entrances and barely scratched the island. Saipan wasn't just a battlefield. It was a 3-layered machine buried under the rock tunnels, chambers, pressure shafts, and fighting galleries carved by hand for months. The Americans guessed maybe 1,000 defenders were inside. The truth was more than 4,000, packed into chambers where airflow and temperature meant survival. And in a system that dense, even a small structural point could act like a valve. If it failed, the entire network would feel the pressure shift. Eleanor didn't know all of that yet. She only had a strange echo and the instinct that it didn't belong. She checked the temperature and humidity reports collected by Marines near the ridge. Underground air was suffocating well over 90 degrees Fahrenheit on the surface, and even hotter deeper in the tunnels. Warmer air meant faster sound. Faster sound changed the length of an echo. She measured again. A 0.16 second return in that thick, humid air meant the signal had bounced off something roughly 48 to 52 meters away. Not a small room, not a straight tunnel, something larger, something engineered. She slowed the audio again. This time she heard a faint wobble riding on top of the echo, a small distortion that pulsed every time the Japanese operator on the other end exhaled. Air moving, returning, breathing. That wasn't electronic distortion. That was airflow in a confined junction, the kind where multiple tunnels fed into one reversible pressure chamber. She dug through captured engineering notes from Guam, flipping pages stained by salt and humidity. The Imperial Japanese 10th Independent Engineer Regiment built their tunnels with predictable spacing, 48-meter intervals for major chambers, regulated pressure nodes feeding 3 or more branches, airflow controlled through narrow necks in the rock. Her echo matched those numbers like a key fitting a lock. If she was right, the Japanese weren't hiding in random holes. They were living inside an underground machine, and that echo had just revealed its central breathing point. Eleanor replayed the signal one more time. The click of the operator's key, the faint tone, then the ghost tone returning behind it, always at 0.16 seconds. She didn't know the full meaning yet, But she knew one thing with absolute certainty. Whatever was beneath Saipan's northern ridge wasn't just a tunnel, it was a system. And for the first time, that system had left a fingerprint. A tiny one, but enough to follow. While Eleanor was isolating a strange echo inside the sweltering intercept room of the USS Maryland, the fight on Saipan was turning into something close to a disaster. Up on the ridge, no one knew a tunnel system was breathing beneath them. They only saw what was right in front of their rifles. Cliffs packed with hidden firing slits, ridges that erupted with gunfire even after being cleared, and Japanese squads appearing from cracks in the rock as if the island itself kept creating new soldiers. By dawn, more than 14,000 Marines were spread across an island barely 15 miles long, trying to move forward on terrain that punished them every time they took a step. The 4th Marine Division was being hit hard along the western ridges. The 2nd Division was struggling on Hill 724, fighting yard by yard for ground that would often be lost again by nightfall. Every advance triggered another ambush. Every secured position turned out to be sitting on top of a vent that fed a deeper gallery. None of the men fighting up there could see the real problem. Over 32 kilometers of tunnels carved beneath their feet. This wasn't a few caves or a scattered defense line. It was an underground network with storage rooms, fighting chambers, machine gun galleries, ventilation shafts, pressure nodes, and access tunnels that looped under the ridges like arteries feeding a hidden body. Intelligence guessed maybe 1,000 defenders remained inside. In reality, there were more than 4,200 packed shoulder to shoulder in stone chambers where airflow was as important as food or ammunition. The Marines had tried everything to find the network's heart. Seismic probes failed. Satchel charges at suspected entrances barely scratched the surface. Even the demolition teams admitted they were guessing. Every collapse they caused simply shifted the air somewhere else and opened new vents nobody had seen before. Inside that underground machine, every meter mattered. A blocked corridor didn't just trap men. It changed how oxygen moved, how heat pooled, and how pressure equalized. And down in the intercept room, Eleanor had just heard the first sign that one of those critical points existed. She did not know the entire system was arranged with almost geometric precision. She did not know that the Japanese engineers had built pressure-controlled junctions at consistent distances, or that one of them was holding thousands of soldiers alive below the ridge. All she had was the Echo 0, 16 seconds long, and the instinct that it didn't belong in any normal radio transmission. She replayed that transmission while the room around her buzzed with the exhaustion of a long campaign. Other operators drifted between their benches, grabbing water, wiping sweat, swapping acetate strips. Nothing seemed urgent on her desk, just another noisy signal from a small field radio. But she could hear the anomaly hiding inside the static, a tiny bounce that repeated with too much consistency to be random. She pulled out humidity notes taken by Marines near the northern ridge. Underground temperatures there reached more than 93 degrees Fahrenheit on average and could climb past 100 degrees Fahrenheit when the tunnels filled with bodies. Heat sped up sound. Faster sound shortened echoes. That meant her measurement was even more exact. The returning bounce pointed to a chamber separation of roughly 48 meters. A long room could do that. A sloped tunnel might. But the wobble, that slight distortion that followed every exhale, didn't fit any simple layout. Air doesn't wobble like that unless it's being pushed through a narrowing. And that narrowing only appears in one kind of structure the Japanese used. A junction where multiple tunnels fed into a single pressure-regulated chamber. She pulled captured engineering notes from Guam. The pages listed 2 standard widths, 1, 2 meters for main corridors, and 0, 7 meters for auxiliary shafts. They also described how Imperial engineers designed pressure nodes at consistent intervals, 48 meters for primary junctions, 98 for secondary chambers, 146 for deeper galleries. It was all matching. At that same moment, Marines on the ridge were radioing back casualty reports. Units were being flanked by Japanese fighters emerging from vents that didn't show on any aerial map. Ammunition crews were hit twice in an hour. Rifle fire echoed through the ravines from angles impossible to trace. Someone shouted over radio that fighters came out of the rocks. To the men above ground, the enemy seemed endless. But the truth was simpler. The tunnels allowed them to be everywhere at once, because the airflow system kept the entire underground army alive and coordinated. If that airflow failed, the whole fortress would begin suffocating within minutes. Eleanor wasn't thinking about suffocation or counterattacks. She was thinking about physics. She measured the echo's decay pattern. The first return dropped slightly. The second grew stronger. The third stabilized. Electronic distortion doesn't do that, but a narrowing rock funnel does. She realized the chamber in the transmission wasn't isolated. It was part of a multi-branch junction, a place where airflow converged, a place where heat, carbon dioxide, and pressure would bottleneck if anything disturbed it. Then she made an even bigger discovery. She compared the signal to another one recorded 36 hours earlier, from a different intercept point on the island. The delay was the same. The wobble was identical. The Japanese operator wasn't moving through the tunnels. He was seated in a fixed location, a chamber that serviced multiple branches, a fixed point, a stable echo, a breathing signature, not random, a regulator chamber. And if she could find that chamber's exact position, she could map where the entire network balanced its airflow, the single point that kept 4,200 men functioning as an organized force under the island. Above ground, Marines were losing men trying to locate hidden firing positions. Below ground, an entire fortress was running on a mistake buried inside one radio signal. And Eleanor Reeves was the only person on Saipan who had heard it. For most of the morning, Eleanor was the only person aboard the USS Maryland who thought the strange echo meant anything. Everyone else treated it the same way they treated dozens of faulty signals every day: interference, atmosphere, broken wiring, fading batteries, things that had no tactical value. But she couldn't shake the feeling that this one wasn't like the usual clutter. Too clean, too consistent, too perfectly spaced. She brought her notes to the Marine liaison officer first. He was exhausted, still wearing dust from the ridge, flipping between casualty reports and sketches of suspected tunnel openings that never led anywhere. He skimmed her page, frowned, and handed it back without a second look. Atmospheric fluctuation, he muttered. Broken antenna. Nothing actionable. That was it. New questions. No curiosity. Just another dead end in a battle full of dead ends. Eleanor walked out without arguing. She didn't need to. She had listened to hundreds of transmissions in the last 9 days, and none of them behaved like this. The echo repeated too precisely. The delay didn't drift. The wobble pulsed at the exact rhythm of someone breathing in a confined chamber. If that was broken wiring, then the whole island was broken wiring. She returned to her bench and replayed the recordings from the previous day. She spread out sheets of tracing paper and charted the echo's rise and fall by hand. Every cycle told the same story. The first bounce fell sharply, the second rose, the third stabilized. That curve belonged to air, traveling through a narrowing choke, not a random tunnel, but the kind of pressure-regulating funnel the Japanese engineers used whenever several branches merged. She didn't need to see the chamber to understand its shape. She could hear it. Meanwhile, messages from the ridge kept pouring in. Marines pinned down by machine gun fire from vents they had never noticed. Squads ambushed by infiltrators who seemed to appear out of solid rock. Demolition teams wasting charges on entrances that only led to dead pockets. The island wasn't behaving like a battlefield. It was behaving like a living machine. By 9 a.m., Eleanor had recalculated the echo's length 9 times. The number didn't change. 48. 6 meters, with a margin of error of 2. Captured engineering notes from Guam listed the exact same spacing for primary regulator nodes in large tunnel complexes. The Japanese didn't guess their distances, they built them according to airflow math. She compared her sketch with a seismic report taken 3 days earlier from the northern ridge. The seismic trace had its own rhythm, a spike, a drop, then a steady plateau. When she overlaid the two curves, they matched at 2 points. Sound and earth were telling the same story. different tools, same structure. It was no longer an intuition, it was evidence. She brought the data to the ship's senior engineer next. He was older, quieter, the sort of man who rarely wasted words because numbers did enough talking. He asked her to replay the intercept. The signal crackled, sputtered, then the echo returned behind the main tone, soft, faint, perfectly timed at 0.16 seconds. He didn't turn away. He didn't dismiss it. He asked her to explain it from the beginning. She showed him the humidity notes, the temperature readings, the expected speed of sound at 31 degrees Celsius, the intervals in captured Japanese construction guides, and the wobble that betrayed a narrowing airflow junction. She laid out every assumption and every correction she'd made. When she finished, the engineer didn't say she was right. He simply asked to see the seismic charts. He spent the next minute studying her hand-drawn curve beside the geological profile. The ship vibrated with engine noise. A typewriter clacked in another room. Somewhere on deck, a Marine shouted across the rails. But inside the plotting space, everything felt still. The two curves matched, not closely. Exactly. He leaned back, exhaled once, and said quietly, "If this chamber exists where your numbers say it does, it's the pressure hinge." Why? He didn't need to explain. The hinge was the center of the system, the part that kept oxygen flowing through all the deeper galleries. Break it, and every chamber relying on that balance would suffocate. Not instantly, but inevitably. He called for the demolition officer. The man arrived with dust on his sleeves, his notebook stuffed with failed entry points and casualty reports from the ridge. He had spent the last 4 days trying to punch holes in the tunnel system with almost no success. Everything they collapsed simply rerouted airflow somewhere else. He didn't want another theory. He wanted a target. But before he dismissed this one, he tested her. Why did the echo grow stronger instead of weaker? Why did the chamber length matter? Why would the system collapse within half an hour? Why wouldn't the airflow reroute like before? Alelenar answered without hesitation. The echo grew stronger because the chamber acted as a natural amplifier when airflow reversed. The chamber length mattered because a 48-meter spacing was the standard regulator interval for networks supporting thousands of men. The system would collapse because breaking a regulator node spikes pressure by more than 20%, which overwhelms the support beams deeper in the system. And the airflow couldn't reroute because the chamber itself was the only place that balanced the 3 major branches. The demolition officer stopped flipping through his notes. For the first time since arriving on Saipan, he was hearing a plan that didn't rely on guesswork or luck. 1,000 pounds of TNT at the right depth, at the right point in the rock, could do more than collapse a room. It could snap the spine of the entire underground fortress. 1 blast, not 7. 1 point. Not an entire ridge. Not a campaign of trial and error, just a blueprint. All of it tied to a 0.16-second whisper nobody else had heard. By 10 a.m., the officer made his decision. They would try it, and the fate of a 4,200-man fortress would depend on whether Alelenar's math was right. By the time the demolition officer agreed to attempt the impossible, the intercept room felt like a furnace. The air barely moved. Sweat collected along the metal edges of the consoles. Alelenor wiped her hands on her uniform and slid another acetate strip into the playback unit. She wasn't looking for anything new, just confirmation that the echo behaved exactly the way she thought it did. She rewound the tape, hit play, and waited. A scratch, a pulse. Then, the faint return at 0.16 seconds, steady as a heartbeat. But this time, she heard something else softer, nearly swallowed by the static. A brief harmonic wobble, like someone had pinched the sound and shaken it. She slowed the recording to half speed. The wobble repeated with each breath from the Japanese operator, rising and falling like the room itself was responding to him. Tunnels don't breathe unless air is being forced through them, and air isn't forced through them unless the system is huge. At 8:23 a.m., she measured the waveform decay again. The first echo dropped. The second rose slightly. The third leveled out at exactly 14.1%. Electronic distortion never behaves that way. A confined airflow chamber does. She checked humidity reports from Marines on the ridge. Underground temperatures could reach 102 degrees Fahrenheit when bodies packed the deeper galleries. Hotter air meant faster sound. Faster sound shaved milliseconds off the echo. She corrected for that, recalculated, and landed on the same number. 48. 6 meters, with a margin of error around 2 meters. The exact spacing used by the Imperial Japanese 10th Independent Engineer Regiment when constructing regulator chambers in stepped ventilation systems. She wasn't listening to a room. She was listening to a design. At 8:47 a.m., she compared the intercept against another recording captured 36 hours earlier. Same tone, same interval, same wobble, same decay. That meant the Japanese operator wasn't moving through tunnels while transmitting. He was in one fixed location, likely a major junction with at least 3 connecting branches. A junction that fed oxygen deeper into the system. A junction that equalized temperature between galleries. A junction that, if destroyed, would cripple everything around it. A pressure regulator chamber. At 9:02 a.m., she carried her findings back to the Marine liaison officer. He dismissed it again, blaming antenna interference. She didn't bother arguing. The wiring wasn't broken, and interference didn't breathe. She went back to her bench and started drawing. She replayed all 8 Japanese recordings recorded over the last 2 days. Each one showed the same pattern. A small acceleration in the echo when the operator paused. Then stabilization. That only happened when a chamber had a single, major air inlet and multiple outlets, a structural center of gravity. She marked each interval. 50 meters, 98 meters, 146 meters, all aligned with known Japanese tunneling doctrine. By 9:31 a.m., she had built a rough underground map, not from photos, not from captured documents, but from sound alone. She traced the intervals onto a grid, following the pattern like footsteps in the dark. Her pencil stopped at an empty contour line, an unremarkable slope Marines had walked past a dozen times. That was the hinge, the breathing node, the single point, balancing air for thousands of men. At 9:46 a.m., she brought her map to the ship's senior engineer. He laid it across the drafting table, tracing each distance with a ruler. The ship hummed under their feet. Heat collected under the overhead vents. The engineer didn't speak while he checked the numbers. He didn't have to. His silence was confirmation. He asked her to replay the signal. The echo returned soft, delayed, perfect. He set his pencil down. "It's real," he said quietly. "If that chamber breaks, the rest will follow." Oh! At 10:09 a.m., he marked load-bearing zones onto a geological cross-section of Saipan's northern ridge. Coral limestone fractured along predictable planes. A blast placed 4 feet into softer limestone would push shockwaves laterally, bending support beams in all 3 connected tunnels. A 20-25% pressure spike. A reversal of airflow. A rapid rise in temperature. Secondary collapses as weakened beams snapped. It wasn't theory. It was physics. At 10:22 a.m., he explained the whole system out loud, almost as if thinking through it. The underground fortress depended entirely on balanced airflow. 3 major branches, the western galleries, the northern fighting positions, and the eastern access tunnels, were all fed by one core chamber. The regulator stabilized temperature, pressure, and oxygen levels for more than 4,200 men. Destroy that chamber, and everything connected to it would suffocate. At 10:37 a.m., he ran a load simulation. 1,000 pounds of TNT placed at precisely the right depth, at precisely the right meter mark, would collapse the chamber roof and send a shock wave into all 3 connected corridors. Air pressure would spike, then reverse, then tear the system inward. Men deeper inside would be driven upward, gasping, carrying overheated ammunition, stumbling into daylight without weapons or orders. Others would be trapped. Some would be buried. The entire network would lose its ability to coordinate movement. The engineer handed the calculations to the demolition officer. At 10:51 a.m., the officer reviewed the map with a different expression on his face. Not doubt, not skepticism. Something closer to opportunity. He had spent days fighting a tunnel system that seemed indestructible, watching smoke rise from vents they hadn't even known existed. Now, for the first time, he was looking at something finite, a target with rules and dimensions, the kind of thing explosives could solve. At 11:06 a.m., the engineer, Ella Lannar, and 2 Marine officers met in the fire control room. She explained the echo timing 0, 16 seconds, always the same. She explained the narrowing, the wobble, the pattern of decay. The engineer explained the physics. The Marines explained the consequences of another night of ambushes. One blast in the right place could do what thousands of men and days of fighting hadn't done, break the underground regiment's spine. At 11:19 a.m., the demolition officer, after 4 days of failure, finally made the call. "We go for the chamber." End quote. Half a mile away, the 4,200 men hidden beneath Saipan's northern ridge had no idea that a single faint echo had just put their entire fortress on the brink of collapse. At 12:03 p.m., the demolition officer stepped onto the deck of the USS Maryland. The heat hit him first, thick, heavy, rolling off the island like the breath of something alive. In his pocket was Lanar's map, folded so many times the edges were starting to soften. It didn't look like much. A handful of pencil lines, 3 intervals, and a point marked on an empty ridge. But if the numbers were right, that point was the hinge of a 4,200-man fortress. He boarded a Higgins boat with a small team of Marines. They didn't know the full plan. They only knew they were being sent to the northern slope, and the officer leading them didn't take 7 charges the way he normally did. He brought one. Just 1,000 pounds of TNT and the coordinates from a woman who'd never set foot on Saipan. The ride was short, but the tension wasn't. Machine gun fire cracked in the distance. Smoke drifted along the cliffs. The ridgeline looked like a set of broken teeth jutting up into the sky. At 12:29 p.m., the Higgins boat grounded on the coral shelf. The sun pressed down like a weight. The Marines moved quickly past squads trading fire with Japanese riflemen hidden in vents they still hadn't mapped. A corporal was dragged down the slope, bleeding from a sniper's shot fired through a crack no wider than a hand. The demolition team didn't stop. They couldn't. The system beneath them could be minutes away from preparing a massive breakout attack. By early estimates, as many as 4,200 soldiers were packed into the deeper galleries. If they coordinated a charge at nightfall as intercepted orders suggested, they could overrun entire regiments. At 12:47 p.m., the demolition officer reached a cluster of jagged boulders along the ridge. He knelt behind them, unfolded Lanar's map, and compared the contour lines to the terrain in front of him. The match was too close to ignore. The 48-meter spacing, the 98-meter secondary interval, the angle of the thermal vent rising from the slope. He felt a faint, warm draft brushing upward through a crack no wider than 2 fingers. Heat rising meant air movement. Air movement meant a chamber beneath them, one deep enough and large enough to push warm, stale oxygen through the rock. He called for a Marine with a thermocouple probe. They inserted the instrument near the crack. The reading jumped. 102 degrees Fahrenheit. That wasn't surface heat. That was the breath of a room full of bodies. At 1:02 p.m., he marked a rectangular zone on the ground about 2 meters long. Coral limestone here was brittle, almost chalk-like. The perfect medium to transmit a shock wave downward and outward. The officer measured again. Every number lined up with Lanar's predictions. The explosion had to sit directly above the regulator chamber's roof. A deviation of even half a meter could waste the blast and give the tunnels time to compensate. He began digging. The Marines worked fast, shoveling out the first layer of rock and debris while Japanese snipers fired sporadically from unseen vents along the ridge. Rifle cracks echoed across the slope. One man returned fire. Another dragged a wounded Marine downhill. But the demolition team didn't stop. Time wasn't measured in minutes anymore. It was measured in breath, thousands of breaths trapped underground, all depending on the airflow of a single chamber. At 1:27 p.m., they hit the target depth 4 feet. The limestone shifted from hard to soft, just as Lanar's notes indicated. This softer layer sat above a reinforced chamber deeper inside, exactly where the pressure regulator should be. The officer unpacked the TNT blocks, 40 of them, 1,000 pounds total, enough to shatter the hinge if the geometry cooperated. He wired the charge, checked every connection twice, then again. No loose wires, no accidental shorts, no second chances. At 1:42 p.m., he radioed the fire control center. Confirmation came back. The window was clear. The wind swept across the ridge, carrying salt and dust. Beneath his feet, he felt a faint hum air being sucked downward through the crack. That was the final sign. The chamber was alive, and it was right below them. At 1:43 p.m., he pressed the detonator. The blast snapped rather than boomed, sending a hard, upward shock wave that blasted limestone dust into the air. The real explosion wasn't above ground. It punched downward, like a hammer, striking the spine of the ridge. The ground lurched as the subterranean chamber ruptured. A pressure spike shot through the 3 connected tunnels at more than 1,000 feet per second. Support beams cracked like dry branches. Stone slabs folded. The network exhaled a long, rolling sigh that vibrated through the soles of their boots. At 1:44 p.m., the warm air rising from the vent stopped. Completely. Instead of rising, it was being pulled backward, an immediate sign that the regulator chamber was no longer functioning. The airflow was collapsing in on itself. At 1:47 p.m., secondary collapses began. A dull rumble, a wave of dust. 3 separate cracks along the ridge blew out at once. Marines shouted warnings. The air shimmered with heat from the sudden shift. A plume of smoke shot upward as a vent ruptured, then thinned too quickly, a sign that deeper galleries were starving for oxygen. The fortress wasn't just damaged, it was destabilizing. At 1:52 p.m., radio reports came in. Marines advancing along the slope were encountering disoriented Japanese soldiers stumbling from vents, gasping, burned by superheated air, carrying ammunition that had overheated in minutes. Some collapsed the moment they reached daylight. They weren't attacking. They were fleeing the heat. The demolition officer didn't need a full report. He already understood. The regulator chamber, the heart of a 32-kilometer tunnel system, was gone, and everything connected to it was beginning to die. At 2 p.m., the ridge finally stopped shaking, but the underground didn't. Beneath the Marines' boots, the island pulsed with a slow, uneven rhythm, as if something buried deep below was failing in steps. The demolition officer counted the intervals, 7 seconds between pulses, then 5, then 4. A system unraveling, not exploding. A machine losing balance. The regulator chamber was gone. Now the fortress had nothing left to stabilize it. At 2:09 p.m., Marines positioned near the northern slopes reported something they had never seen in 9 days of fighting. Groups of Japanese soldiers appearing from vents that weren't supposed to exist. They weren't coordinated. They weren't armed properly. Some carried nothing but empty canteens. Others stumbled as if drunk, gasping in the open air. One soldier collapsed 20 feet from the ridge edge, choking, eyes watering from heat that had seared his throat. He hadn't been in a firefight. He had been forced upward by the temperature spike inside the chambers. Underground temperatures in the deeper galleries were nearing 109 degrees Fahrenheit, and oxygen levels were falling so fast that even trained soldiers couldn't stay conscious. Saipan's tunnel network had been built to resist bombardment, not internal thermal shock. At 2:17 p.m., the first major plume erupted. A column of dust shot upward from a fissure 60 yards west of the blast site, followed by a blast of superheated air. Marines instinctively ducked. The plume vanished as quickly as it appeared, proof that airflow wasn't rising anymore. It had reversed direction and then died. One vent down, then another, then another. The underground system depended on a coordinated exchange between 3 major intake shafts and 7 smaller outflow channels. The regulator chamber, the very point Eleanor had detected through a 0.16-second echo, had been the conductor of that airflow. Now, with it gone, nothing coordinated anything. Air stagnated. Heat built. Carbon dioxide surged, and the deeper tunnels began to suffocate. At 2:19 p.m., A forward observer radioed a sound like distant thunder echoing underground. It wasn't thunder. It was the collapse of Corridor 12, a 120-foot passage leading toward the eastern storage galleries. The pressure reversal had slammed weakened beams until they warped, cracked, and snapped. The roof sheared downward, sealing the tunnel near the center. Dust billowed from cracks higher up the slope. A predicted failure, exactly the pattern Eleanor's calculations mapped. "The system is folding," the observer said. At 2:23 p.m., Marines advancing along the ridge encountered a new wave of soldiers climbing out of vents alone, disorganized, choking. These weren't infiltrators. They weren't part of a breakout. They were trying to survive. Deeper chambers had become ovens. Carbon dioxide was rising faster than the air could escape. Inside those galleries, operators abandoned positions. Ammunition overheated. Metal warped. Beams groaned under shifting pressure. The Japanese had built the fortress to withstand everything except the one thing they hadn't considered. What happens when the airflow that sustains you suddenly reverses and dies? At 2:26 p.m., the second major collapse hit. A deep boom rolled under the ridge like a drum beat, pushing up a wave of dust that drifted across the slope like smoke from a crater. That collapse came from Chamber 5, one of the deeper barracks believed to house up to 80 men. The coral limestone fractured along its natural fault veins. The ceiling sagged 8 inches in 1 second, then tore loose completely. Superheated dust blasted into connected shafts, emerging from 3 cracks almost simultaneously. Marines saw it and instantly understood. The structural nerve center was gone. Everything connected to it was failing. At 2:31 p.m., ground temperatures around the ridge spiked another one, 8 degrees. It doesn't sound like much until you realize it signaled a thermal bottleneck deep underground. Heat was trapping itself in the galleries like a pressure cooker. Bodies packed tightly. Air no longer circulating. Carbon dioxide climbing. In the deeper layers, decision-making broke down. Some soldiers abandoned rifles. Others crawled upward blindly, following any draft of cooler air they could find. At 2:36 p.m., a Marine squad intercepted a group of 17 Japanese soldiers trying to escape a failed shaft. They weren't attacking. They weren't even able to run. Their faces were gray. Their breaths were shallow. 5 were captured alive. An interpreter questioned a sergeant who could barely speak. He whispered one phrase, "Our tunnels are dead. Ease." He pointed downward, made a collapsing motion with his hand, then mimicked a slow exhale, the death of a breathing system. At 2:41 p.m., a new signal flickered across Eleanor's receiver on the same Japanese frequency she had been monitoring all morning. The Morse rhythm was broken, uneven, the tone shaky. The operator on the other end was struggling not with code but with consciousness. Then Eleanor heard something missing. The echo, gone. Not shortened, not distorted, gone. The chamber producing that echo no longer existed in any survivable form. What remained below the ridge was a labyrinth of dying pockets, isolated chambers cut off from each other, air stagnant, movement impossible to coordinate. At 2:47 p.m., a third seismic pulse shook the island, stronger than the last. A 4-second rumble cracked a boulder along its seam and sent debris sliding down the slope. That collapse came from the broad gallery linked to the western fighting tunnels where nearly 900 soldiers were believed to be stationed. With the pressure network broken, those galleries became ovens. Temperatures rose another 6 degrees. Oxygen levels plummeted. Men inside had no choice but to flee or suffocate. Marines on the ridge later recalled what the escape looked like. Dozens of disoriented fighters emerging from vents they had never even noticed. Uniforms soaked, movement staggered, ammunition belts dragging behind them. The fortress that once fought like a coordinated army was now spilling out men who looked like survivors of a shipwreck. At 2:55 p.m., a Marine platoon pushing along the upper ridge met almost no resistance. Firing slits that had poured machine gun fire the previous day were silent. When engineers reached a main entrance, they found it blocked by a curtain of fused limestone, heat-welded, immovable. The tunnel system, the backbone of Saipan's defense, was destroying itself from the inside. By 3 p.m., the demolition officer radioed USS Maryland. Pressure collapses total. multiple galleries compromised. When one of their won, no further explanation was needed. The fortress was finished. The breakout attack was dead. The Echo had done what artillery and flamethrowers could not. By 3:04 p.m., the northern ridge of Saipan felt different, not like a battlefield easing off, but like something underneath was giving up. Marines advancing along the slopes noticed it before anyone said it out loud. The vents that had spat fire for days were quiet. No rifles cracking from hidden slits. No sudden eruptions of machine gun bursts. The air felt hotter, heavier, and strangely still. At 3:11 p.m., scouts from the 24th Marines advanced 160 yards in under 15 minutes movement they hadn't achieved in 2 days. One sergeant paused near a fighting slit that had pinned them the previous morning. He waited for the muzzle flash he expected. Nothing. Inside the chamber, a Type 96 light machine gun lay abandoned, barrel still warm, ammunition scattered like someone had dropped everything and run. The bunker wasn't empty from retreat. It was empty from collapse. By 3:19 p.m., confirmation came from every front. The tunnel system was no longer acting as a single organism. It wasn't feeding fighters into positions. It wasn't coordinating ambushes. It wasn't exhaling heat through vents in the predictable rhythm Marines had learned to watch for. Instead, the island felt hollow, as if the underground galleries had turned into dead space. Medical teams began reporting the condition of newly captured Japanese soldiers. Their core temperatures were spiking past 104 degrees Fahrenheit. Their pulses were irregular. Their uniforms were drenched with moisture from condensation dripping off overheated ceilings. Some could barely stand long enough to be questioned. When interpreters asked what had happened underground, several repeated the same phrase. The mountain exhaled. The spastok. For them, the collapse wasn't tactical. It was elemental. Like the island itself had turned against them. At 3:26 p.m., Marine patrols entering the north-central sector found tunnel mouths sealed shut by enormous slabs of limestone. These weren't doors. They were entire roof segments that had sheared off and fallen straight down, wedging themselves into entrances like tombstones. Engineers tried to dig into one of them, but the stone didn't crumble. It had fused under the heat of internal friction. Inside that single collapsed gallery, the cave-in stretched nearly 70 feet from the sealed entrance to the fracture line. Another gallery farther south had collapsed along its entire ceiling, a slab 9 feet across punching straight through the floor. The Japanese had spent months carving these chambers. One blast placed exactly where Ella Laner's numbers said it should had undone all of it. By 3:41 p.m., reports from the 2nd and 4th Marine Divisions revealed something even more decisive. Infiltrator activity had dropped by 90%. The night ambushes that had cost countless Marines their lives had simply stopped. No more small units slipping through vents. No more coordinated harassment attacks. Whatever was left inside the network was scattered, suffocating, or trapped behind walls of fallen stone. The fortress hadn't been conquered. It had collapsed faster than anyone imagined. At 4:05 p.m., the commanding general of the 2nd Marine Division wrote in his field log that the ridge opened like a gate. His men pushed forward with an ease they hadn't felt since landing 9 days earlier. They no longer fought in constant fear of an unseen threat under their feet. The ground felt stable for the first time, and all of it traced back to a signal almost thrown away. At 4:22 p.m., the 23rd Marines confirmed that infiltrator routes into the northern plains had gone silent. With the pressure regulator chamber gone, deeper galleries couldn't support large groups anymore. Any attempt to move together caused oxygen levels to crash. Heat rose. Men passed out before reaching the surface. The breakout attack, the one that could have cost more than 1,000 American lives, never happened. By evening, the scale of the event became clear. The Japanese defense on Saipan had been built on an assumption that their tunnels would outlast any American assault, but they had never considered that the system could tear itself apart from the inside. When airflow failed, the fortress turned into a trap. At 5:08 p.m. U.S., command staff ran casualty projections for what would have happened if the tunnel network had remained intact. The estimate was grim: 1,200 to 1,000 800 additional American casualties in a nighttime assault supported by hidden galleries. Those numbers never materialized. The blast at 1:43 p.m., guided by an echo, had removed the threat before it reached the battlefield. By 6:11 p.m., the northern plains were open. Marines advanced across ground that had been lethal hours earlier. They found abandoned fighting positions, chambers fused shut, surface vents collapsed like crushed chimneys. The underground regiment that had once bled American units dry had fractured into isolated pockets. By nightfall, Saipan was quiet in a way it hadn't been since the first Marines landed. Only scattered rifle cracks echoed along the island's spine. No coordinated counterattacks, no movement from deeper tunnels, just silence rising from a fortress that had lost its ability to breathe. At 7:30 p.m., 2 days after the collapse, the northern ridge was fully secured. By July 9th, Saipan itself was declared captured. And with it came something larger than a single island's fate. The Marianas were now within reach of B-29 bombers. Japan's mainland, the heart of the empire, was suddenly inside American striking distance. A shift in the entire Pacific War. And none of that context existed for Eleanor in the moment. She received only one brief message that afternoon. Pressure collapse total. Network neutralized. End quote. No mention of her name. No credit. No recognition. Just confirmation that the echo she heard, that small, fragile detail, was enough to break a fortress built to be unbreakable. By early evening, the noise of battle had faded into scattered cracks far down Saipan's spine. The northern ridge where thousands of men had fought, bled, crawled, and died for every foot of volcanic ground was strangely still. Heat drifted upward through fractured vents. The air carried dust, limestone, and something harder to name, the residue of a fortress that no longer existed. Beneath those ridges, where more than 4,200 Japanese soldiers had once waited in a labyrinth built to outlast bombardment and exhaust every American advance, only broken chambers and pockets of dead air remained. The network that Tokyo believed would hold for weeks had fallen in less than half an hour. Not from artillery, not from tanks, not from a massed assault, from a 0.16-second detail hidden in a signal nearly thrown away. At 7:11 p.m., Eleanor Reeves stepped out onto the deck of the USS Maryland for the first time all day. The sky over Saipan had turned deep amber. The Pacific wind carried the faint scent of cordite drifting from the northern slopes. She didn't know exactly which chambers had collapsed or where the blast site lay. She didn't know how many lives had been spared. She only knew the echo she'd heard that morning no longer existed. She had erased it. That absence was its own confirmation, quieter, heavier, more final than any report. She leaned against the railing for a moment, letting the heat roll past her. Below, landing craft bumped against the ship's hull. Crewmen shouted to each other across the deck. A few looked toward the island, maybe sensing the shift without knowing why. Eleanor didn't expect thanks. She didn't expect recognition. That wasn't why she replayed the signal. But the weight of what had happened, of what her pencil, her ruler, and her stubbornness had set in motion settled in slowly, like a tide pushing in. Somewhere beneath the ridge, thousands of men were either trapped or trying to escape through collapsed shafts. The network that had felt like a single breathing body in the echo had died. Not quietly, the collapse was violent, but the end result was silence. At 7:18 p.m., a Marine officer walking past recognized her from the intercept room. He didn't know the full story. He didn't know about the echo, the calculations, the arguments, the map, but he knew the ridge had exhaled its last breath that afternoon. He paused, nodded once, a gesture more respectful than any metal could capture. He moved on, leaving Eleanor alone on the deck with the last light of the day stretching across the ocean. At 7:26 p.m., a faint signal flickered across the Japanese frequency she had monitored all morning. Not a coordinated message, just broken Morse, uneven, fading in and out. The operator sending it was likely close to the surface, maybe the last one near a vent that hadn't collapsed completely. The rhythm was wrong. The speed was wrong. Everything about it sounded tired. And then she noticed the most important absence of all. No echo. No harmonic return. No breathing pattern behind the main tone. The fortress wasn't answering back. Because there was nothing left to answer. Eleanor listened once. Then she shut the receiver off. The message wasn't intelligence anymore. It was the dying pulse of a system that no longer existed. At 7:41 p.m., the official report about the northern sector's stabilization reached Maryland. The language was clean, clinical, stripped of emotion. Underground galleries compromised. Resistance disrupted. Enemy movement degraded. Nowhere did it mention her. Nowhere did it describe what had actually broken the tunnels. History would remember the regiments that fought on the ridges, the battalions that advanced across volcanic slopes, the commanders who pushed north, the capture of Saipan, the shift in the Pacific that followed, but not the moment in a cramped, overheated intercept room when someone noticed a sound no one else listened for. At 7:58 p.m., the deck lights blinked on. Night settled across the island. Marines dug into new lines, preparing for whatever came next. They didn't know why their advance had been easier that afternoon. They didn't need to. Only one person aboard the battleship understood the chain of events from signal to collapse, and she kept her notes in a folder no historian would ever ask for. By the time darkness settled fully over Saipan, the ridge that had fought like a living thing all week was silent. No vents breathing heat, no hidden rifles cracking from the stone, no sign of the underground regiment that had shaped every hour of the battle. It was all still. Still, in the way something is after it breaks. In the intercept room aboard the USS Maryland, Eleanor Reeves gathered her papers, acetate strips, hand-drawn curves, the rough map built from nothing but sound. There was no briefing waiting for her, no superior calling her in, no one asking how she had found the chamber. The daily logs made room for battles, bombardments, troop movements, not for one echo. She slipped the folder into a drawer, not because she expected someone to read it, but because she couldn't bring herself to throw it away. The ridge had changed because of those numbers, because she kept listening when everyone else moved on. On the island, patrols continued pushing into the northern plains. They found collapsed galleries, sealed shafts, and chambers warped by heat. They found rifles left where they were dropped, helmets buried under fallen stone, ammunition cooked off by sudden temperature spikes. The scale of the internal failure was impossible to ignore, but there was no neat story to tie to it. No image for a newspaper. No single moment to photograph. At dawn the next morning, the Marines moved forward again. By July 9th, Saipan was declared secure, and from that point on, the Pacific shifted. The Marianas came within the range of B-29 bombers. Tokyo, once distant, was suddenly vulnerable. The battle would be remembered in strategy books, in timelines, in casualty counts, but the chain of events that made the turning point possible, the signal, the echo, the pencil-drawn map, was absorbed into the larger war, quiet and unnoticed. Only one person on that ship knew how close the Americans had come to facing a 4,000-man counterattack that night. Only one person knew how a fortress designed to survive everything had undone itself because of a sound almost too small to hear. And she never claimed credit. She never stood in a spotlight. She simply walked back to her bench the next morning and kept listening. Because sometimes the detail everyone else ignores is the one that changes the course of a war.